The strongest wolves are not the ones that never lose control. They are the ones who finally discover the one soul worth becoming gentle for. Moonlight spilled across the towering cliffs surrounding Blackwood Keep, turning ancient stone walls into silver silhouettes against the quiet Appalachian Mountains. A cold autumn wind swept through the pine trees, carrying with it an uneasy stillness that every guard on the midnight watch immediately recognized. Torches flickered. Horses shifted nervously inside their stables. Even the oldest wolves resting along the outer courtyard slowly lifted their heads toward the eastern tower, as if listening for something invisible. Deep inside the castle, Ethan Blackwood stood alone on the highest balcony, his broad shoulders tense beneath a dark wool coat, while his gray eyes remained fixed on the endless forest below. The kingdom slept peacefully, unaware that its alpha king had not truly rested in months. Every night, the same battle returned. It began with silence. Then came the restless breathing. Then the strange pressure building somewhere deep inside his chest, like a storm searching desperately for an opening. Ethan closed his eyes, gripping the cold stone railing until his knuckles turned pale. He counted each slow breath exactly as the royal physicians had instructed him. 1, 2, 3. Nothing helped anymore. The ancient wolf spirit that had protected generations of Blackwood rulers had grown increasingly unsettled during the past year. It no longer responded to discipline. It ignored meditation. It rejected every ritual the pack elders had practiced for centuries. Instead, it paced endlessly beneath his skin, restless, lonely, and impossible to understand. A sharp gust of wind crossed the balcony, and Ethan immediately felt the familiar wave of unease spread through his body. His heartbeat accelerated. The air itself suddenly seemed too heavy to breathe. Far below, several guards exchanged worried glances after hearing a low, sorrowful howl echo across the mountains. No one spoke. Everyone inside Blackwood Keep knew what that sound meant. The Alpha King was struggling again. Within minutes, the palace physician, too, senior pack elders, and Captain Mason Brooks hurried toward the eastern tower. They had followed this routine countless times before. Herbal remedies were prepared. Ancient prayers were quietly recited. Every possible tradition had already been attempted more times than anyone wished to remember. Ethan never blamed them for failing. He simply accepted that some burdens belonged to him alone. As the heavy wooden doors opened behind him, Elder Nathan stepped forward carefully. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "please come inside before the night grows colder." Ethan never turned around. The cold is not the problem. His voice remained steady, yet exhaustion hid beneath every word. The elder lowered his head. He knew there was nothing left to say. Just beyond the balcony, unnoticed by nearly everyone present, a young Omega servant quietly carried a basket of freshly folded blankets through the hallway. Evelyn Carter had worked inside Blackwood Keep for almost 2 years. She cleaned guest rooms, helped prepare the library every morning, and often delivered warm meals to elderly staff members who could no longer manage the steep castle stairs. Most people appreciated her kindness without ever truly seeing her. She had become one of those gentle souls who quietly made every place around her better while asking for nothing in return. As Evelyn approached the eastern corridor, she immediately sensed the unusual tension filling the air. Guards stood silently outside the balcony entrance while servants whispered worried prayers beneath their breath. Curious but respectful, she slowed her pace. Through the slightly open doorway, she caught only a brief glimpse of the Alpha King standing alone beneath the moonlight, his posture rigid against the endless night. Something inside her heart tightened unexpectedly. She could not explain why. She had never spoken more than a polite greeting to Ethan Blackwood. Yet seeing someone carry such overwhelming loneliness stirred a quiet compassion she had always found impossible to ignore. Without thinking, she gently placed the basket upon a nearby bench and took one cautious step closer. The wind suddenly shifted. Ethan's breathing became noticeably heavier, and every guard instinctively reached for the weapons they never wished to use. The atmosphere tightened like a drawn bowstring. No one noticed Evelyn standing quietly in the doorway until she spoke almost instinctively, her voice barely louder than the rustling autumn leaves. "Easy, you are safe." The words floated gently through the cold night. They were not spoken to a king. They were not even spoken to a man. They were offered with the same calm tenderness someone might use to comfort a frightened animal caught alone in a storm. For one impossibly quiet moment, the mountain wind stopped. Ethan's shoulders slowly relaxed. His breathing steadied. The invisible weight pressing against the night seemed to disappear as naturally as mist beneath the morning sun. The sorrowful tension that had filled the balcony only seconds earlier quietly dissolved, leaving behind nothing except peaceful silence. Every guard stared in stunned confusion. Elder Nathan looked toward Ethan before looking back at the young Omega standing near the doorway, unable to understand what had just happened. Ethan himself opened his eyes slowly, feeling a calm he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. Yet before he could turn to discover why, Evelyn quietly picked up her basket, lowered her eyes with respectful humility, and disappeared into the sleeping castle without realizing that for one brief moment, she had accomplished what no healer, elder, or king had been able to do. Early morning sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of Blackwood Keep, painting long ribbons of gold across the polished stone floors while the castle slowly awakened to another autumn day. Bells echoed gently from the chapel tower, cooks prepared fresh bread in the kitchens, and stable hands greeted the horses with familiar smiles as cool mountain air drifted through the open courtyards. Nothing about the peaceful morning suggested that something extraordinary had happened only hours before. The strange calm that had settled over the Alpha King during the previous night quietly became another unanswered mystery tucked away beneath the endless responsibilities of palace life. Ethan Blackwood stood inside the council chamber reviewing reports delivered from neighboring packs. His posture remained composed, his voice measured, and his judgment as steady as ever. To every advisor seated around the long oak table, he appeared exactly as their king always had. Only Captain Mason Brooks noticed one remarkable difference. Ethan's eyes no longer carried the deep exhaustion that had shadowed them for months. During a brief pause in the meeting, Mason quietly leaned toward Elder Nathan. "Did he sleep?" he whispered. The elderly pack leader slowly nodded. "For nearly 5 hours." Mason blinked in disbelief. The Alpha King had rarely managed more than 2 restless hours of sleep during the past year. Yet neither man understood why the impossible had suddenly become reality. Their conversation ended as Ethan calmly resumed discussing harvest routes and winter preparations, never mentioning the strange peace he himself could not explain. While the kingdom focused upon its daily work, Evelyn Carter followed the ordinary routine that had shaped nearly every morning since arriving at Blackwood Keep. She tied her light brown hair into a simple braid, gathered fresh linens from the laundry room, and greeted every servant she passed with the same gentle smile that expected nothing in return. Some answered warmly. Others barely noticed her. Evelyn accepted both with equal kindness. She had learned long ago that recognition was never the true reward for helping others. Before beginning her assigned duties, she quietly stopped outside the small greenhouse tucked beside the western gardens. The elderly groundskeeper, Mr. Henry Collins, struggled each morning to water the delicate flowers because arthritis had stiffened his hands during the colder months. Without announcing herself, Evelyn gently took the heavy watering can from beside the door. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," she said with cheerful warmth. The old man looked up and smiled immediately. "I was hoping you would pass by today." Together, they spent the next 20 minutes caring for rows of white lilies, lavender, and climbing roses. Evelyn listened patiently as he shared stories about the castle gardens before Ethan had become Alpha King. She laughed at his memories, admired every flower as though seeing it for the first time, and thanked him for teaching her the names of plants she had never known growing up. When their work finished, Mr. Collins quietly watched her continue toward the castle carrying another basket of fresh linens. "That young lady leaves every place brighter than she finds it," he murmured to himself. Similar moments quietly followed her throughout the day. She helped an elderly cook lift a heavy pot onto the stove before slipping away without waiting for thanks. She repaired a torn storybook for one of the village children visiting the castle with his parents. She comforted a frightened puppy hiding beneath the stable stairs after a sudden clap of thunder rolled across the distant mountains. None of these small acts attracted attention. They simply became part of the quiet rhythm of Evelyn's life. Kindness offered so naturally that most people barely noticed it happening. Late that afternoon, Ethan crossed the central courtyard after finishing a meeting with neighboring landowners. As he walked beneath rows of crimson maple trees, he unexpectedly paused. A familiar sense of calm settled quietly over him once again. The constant tension beneath his ribs eased almost instantly. He looked around the courtyard with thoughtful curiosity. Nearby, several servants carried baskets toward the laundry house. Gardeners trimmed autumn hedges beside the fountain. Stable hands led horses toward fresh pasture. Nothing appeared unusual. Then his eyes briefly rested upon a young Omega walking across the far side of the courtyard with folded blankets balanced carefully in her arms. She never looked toward him. She simply smiled while helping another servant gather linens that had slipped onto the stone path before continuing on her way. Ethan watched her disappear through an archway. The peaceful feeling remained for several long moments before gradually fading after she left his sight. He frowned slightly, unable to explain the strange coincidence. Across the courtyard, Evelyn continued working without the slightest idea that the Alpha King had even noticed her passing. To her, it had been another ordinary afternoon inside a castle where she remained almost invisible. Yet somewhere deep beneath the quiet discipline of Ethan's ancient wolf, something had already begun recognizing the gentle presence of one heart long before the man himself ever would. Some hearts recognize each other long before either soul understands why. 3 quiet days passed beneath clear autumn skies, and life inside Blackwood keeps settled into its familiar rhythm once again. The mystery surrounding the Alpha King's unexpected calm gradually faded from conversation as council meetings, trade negotiations, and harvest preparations demanded everyone's attention. Elder Nathan quietly recorded every unusual detail inside the royal archives, hoping that time might eventually reveal an explanation no ancient text had yet offered. Captain Mason Brooks remained observant but chose not to burden Ethan with theories built upon coincidence. After all, a king already carried enough unanswered questions without adding one more. Yet coincidence became increasingly difficult to believe. Every morning, Ethan followed the same carefully disciplined schedule. He reviewed reports in the council chamber, inspected the training grounds, met with village representatives, and walked through different sections of the castle to greet both servants and guests. Without intending to, his path crossed Evelyn Carter's routine several times each day. Sometimes she emerged from the greenhouse carrying baskets filled with freshly cut flowers for the dining hall. Sometimes she delivered clean linens to guest rooms. Other times, she simply crossed the courtyard while helping elderly staff members finish work that had become difficult for them alone. Ethan rarely exchanged more than a polite nod with her. Their conversations never lasted beyond simple greetings. Still, something impossible continued repeating itself. Whenever Evelyn happened to be nearby, the constant pressure resting beneath Ethan's chest quietly dissolved. His breathing slowed naturally. The invisible restlessness that had haunted him for months seemed to settle into peaceful silence. Without effort. Then, after she disappeared from sight, the familiar uneasiness slowly returned. Ethan noticed the pattern but refused to draw conclusions from it. He had spent too many years learning that kings who relied upon unexplained feelings often made dangerous decisions. Instead, he convinced himself the peaceful moments were nothing more than fortunate accidents. Meanwhile, someone else had begun noticing the same strange rhythm. Orion, the elderly silver wolf who had lived beside 3 generations of the Blackwood family, spent most afternoons resting beneath the great oak tree overlooking the central gardens. The old wolf had grown quiet with age, rarely showing interest in passing visitors. Yet every time Evelyn entered the gardens carrying flowers or books for the children, Orion slowly rose to his feet and calmly followed her from a respectful distance. He never demanded attention. He simply walked beside her until she completed her work before quietly returning to his favorite place beneath the tree. Several servants found the behavior unusual. "He barely follows the Alpha anymore," one stable hand whispered while watching Orion trail behind Evelyn one peaceful afternoon. Another servant smiled. "Maybe he simply likes kind people." Neither realized that Orion's calm amber eyes remained fixed upon Evelyn for reasons far older than simple affection. Animals often notice truths that people overlooked. Later that week, Ethan visited the village school located just beyond the castle walls. He made these visits every month, believing that a kingdom remained strongest when its youngest generation felt seen by its leader. Children greeted him with excited smiles, while teachers proudly displayed artwork celebrating the coming harvest festival. During the visit, one shy little girl accidentally dropped a basket filled with colored pencils across the classroom floor. Before anyone else reacted, Evelyn quietly knelt beside the child and helped gather every scattered pencil with patient care. She had accompanied several palace servants delivering new blankets and books donated by the castle. The frightened little girl relaxed almost immediately beneath Evelyn's gentle smile. Ethan watched the simple interaction from across the room. Once again, an unexpected feeling of quiet peace settled inside him. His ancient wolf, usually restless beneath crowded gatherings, became completely still. Not sleepy, not weak, simply content. It felt almost like hearing a familiar song remembered from childhood after believing it had been forgotten forever. Ethan looked toward Elder Nathan, who had been observing the classroom from another corner. The elderly pack leader noticed the alpha's unusually relaxed posture and quietly followed his line of sight until his eyes rested upon Evelyn. For only a brief moment, the old elder frowned thoughtfully before saying nothing. Some observations required patience before they became wisdom. As the afternoon ended, Evelyn remained behind for a few extra minutes, helping the children organize their bookshelves before returning to the castle with the other servants. She never realized that the Alpha King's gaze followed her departure just a little longer than courtesy required. She certainly never imagined that while the people inside Blackwood Keep continued seeing only an ordinary Omega quietly serving everyone around her, the ancient wolf spirit living within their king had already reached a conclusion that the human heart still refused to understand. Somewhere deep beyond reason, beyond tradition, and beyond every explanation preserved inside the oldest pack records, the wolf had already found the one presence that finally felt like home. The easiest way to protect a fragile heart is often to convince yourself that distance is wisdom. Ethan Blackwood repeated that thought silently as another cool autumn morning settled over Blackwood Keep. The strange peace that continued appearing whenever Evelyn Carter happened to be nearby no longer felt like coincidence. Yet accepting any other explanation made him deeply uncomfortable. He had spent his entire adult life mastering discipline. Kings were expected to lead with reason rather than instinct. They could not afford mysterious attachments built upon feelings they did not understand. If his wolf had begun responding to one quiet Omega servant, then the safest choice was simple. He would create distance before either of them became dependent upon something neither could explain. The decision sounded logical inside his mind, but it settled heavily inside his chest. During the following days, Ethan quietly adjusted his routine. Instead of crossing the western gardens where Evelyn often helped Mr. Henry Collins care for the flowers, he used the northern corridor leading directly to the council chamber. He asked Captain Mason Brooks to deliver inspection reports rather than visiting the laundry house himself. When village children arrived for their weekly reading hour inside the library, Ethan chose to review military records instead of greeting the families as he normally did. No one questioned the changes. To everyone else, they simply appeared to be small adjustments within the busy schedule of an Alpha King. Only Ethan noticed the immediate consequences. The peaceful stillness that had briefly returned to his life quietly disappeared. Sleep became restless again. Long meetings left him exhausted. The invisible weight beneath his ribs slowly returned until every breath once again required deliberate control. His wolf grew increasingly unsettled, pacing silently beneath the calm expression he presented to everyone around him. Late one afternoon, Elder Nathan found Ethan standing alone inside the castle observatory overlooking the valley below. The elderly pack leader studied the young king with thoughtful concern before speaking gently. "You look tired again." Ethan offered a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "There is simply more work than usual." Nathan remained silent for a moment. After serving the Blackwood family for over 40 years, he recognized the difference between physical fatigue and emotional struggle. "Sometimes," the elder said quietly, "we mistake avoidance for strength." Ethan turned toward the mountain horizon. "Sometimes distance protects people." Nathan did not argue. "Sometimes it only protects fear." Those words lingered long after the elder quietly left the observatory. Meanwhile, Evelyn noticed none of the silent battle unfolding inside the Alpha King. She simply observed that their paths no longer crossed as often. At first, she assumed his responsibilities had become heavier with the changing season. She never imagined he was intentionally avoiding places where she might appear. Her own days remained filled with ordinary kindness. She spent one morning helping the palace seamstress repair winter coats for village children whose families could not afford new clothing before the first snowfall arrived. Another afternoon, she quietly carried homemade soup to an elderly librarian recovering from a stubborn cold. Whenever someone thanked her, she answered with the same gentle smile and continued about her work. Recognition had never been the reason she cared for people. One rainy evening, Evelyn stopped beneath the covered walkway connecting the greenhouse to the main castle. Orion rested nearby, watching the rain fall across the gardens with calm amber eyes. The old wolf slowly approached her without hesitation and gently leaned his large head against her shoulder. Evelyn laughed softly while scratching behind his ears. "You always seem to know when someone needs company." Orion closed his eyes contentedly. From an upstairs balcony, Ethan happened to witness the quiet moment below. Hidden by the falling rain, he watched the elderly wolf standing peacefully beside Evelyn with complete trust. A strange ache settled inside his heart. He should have walked away immediately. Instead, he remained there for several silent moments until Evelyn disappeared into the castle, carrying an umbrella over an elderly servant who could barely manage the slippery stone path alone. Ethan finally turned from the balcony, frustrated by emotions he refused to name. He reminded himself once more that maintaining distance remained the responsible choice. He believed he was protecting a kind young Omega from becoming entangled in the complicated burdens surrounding an Alpha King. He never considered another possibility. Perhaps the one truly being protected was himself. Because somewhere beneath the discipline, the duty, and every carefully constructed wall around his heart, the ancient wolf had already begun quietly longing for the one peaceful presence it's human half kept choosing to leave behind. Kindness rarely announces itself with grand speeches. More often it arrives quietly, changes someone's day, and leaves before anyone thinks to say thank you. The first cold winds of late October drifted through Blackwood Keep, carrying the scent of pine, fresh rain, and wood smoke across the mountain valley. Servants hurried to prepare fireplaces for the coming winter, while merchants delivered blankets, flour, and firewood from nearby villages. Every hallway echoed with busy footsteps. Yet amid the constant movement, one familiar figure continued living almost unnoticed. Evelyn Carter greeted each sunrise before most of the castle awakened. She helped the kitchen staff knead fresh bread, arranged flowers gathered from the greenhouse along the dining hall windows, and checked on elderly workers before beginning her assigned duties. No one instructed her to do these extra tasks. She simply believed that every difficult day became a little easier when someone quietly carried part of another person's burden. One chilly morning, she noticed Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the oldest laundress in the castle, struggling to carry 2 heavy baskets across the courtyard. The woman insisted she could manage, but her hands trembled with every careful step. Without interrupting her conversation with another servant, Evelyn walked over, lifted one basket with an easy smile, and matched the older woman's slow pace. They crossed the courtyard together while sharing simple stories about favorite autumn recipes and childhood memories. By the time they reached the laundry house, Mrs. Hayes was laughing instead of apologizing for needing help. "You always make people forget what they were worrying about," the older woman said warmly. Evelyn only smiled. Sometimes people only need someone willing to walk beside them for a little while. Later that afternoon, a young stable boy named Lucas accidentally tore his winter coat while repairing a fence near the paddock. Embarrassed, he tried hiding the damaged sleeve beneath his arm because he knew his family could not afford another coat before the first snowfall. Evelyn quietly noticed the ripped fabric, but said nothing. That evening, after finishing her own work, she borrowed a sewing kit from the palace seamstress and carefully repaired the coat by hand before placing it neatly outside the boy's small room. The next morning, Lucas searched the hallway, hoping to discover who had helped him. No one answered his questions. Evelyn had already returned to sweeping the library floor as though nothing unusual had happened. Similar moments quietly multiplied throughout the week. She read storybooks to children while their parents attended meetings inside the castle. She prepared warm herbal tea for Mr. Henry Collins after noticing the cold morning air had worsened the pain in his hands. She left fresh bread outside the quarters of a young guard who had spent several nights caring for his sick mother in the village. Every act remained anonymous whenever possible. Praise embarrassed her more than hard work ever could. Orion seemed determined never to leave her side for long. Whenever Evelyn entered the gardens, the elderly silver wolf slowly followed behind with calm dignity, resting nearby while she trimmed flowers or watered plants. The servants began smiling whenever they saw them together. "The old guardian has chosen his favorite person," one gardener joked gently. Evelyn laughed softly and scratched behind Orion's ears. "I think he simply enjoys peaceful company." Orion closed his eyes as though quietly agreeing. From the balcony outside his private study, Ethan watched the scene unfold without revealing his presence. The sight stirred conflicting emotions inside him. He admired the effortless compassion Evelyn offered everyone around her, yet he continued convincing himself that maintaining distance remained the wisest choice. Even so, he found his attention repeatedly drawn toward the places she had visited. The greenhouse somehow seemed brighter after she left. The library felt calmer whenever children gathered around her for afternoon stories. Even the servants appeared to smile more freely after speaking with her. Ethan began noticing changes that had nothing to do with his restless wolf. The atmosphere of the castle itself shifted wherever Evelyn spent her time. She never demanded respect. She never sought recognition. She simply carried quiet warmth into ordinary moments until lonely people no longer felt quite so alone. Standing alone beneath the fading afternoon light, Ethan realized something that unsettled him far more than the strange peace his wolf experienced in her presence. Blackwood Keep had always relied upon his strength to protect the kingdom from danger. Yet without anyone realizing it, one gentle Omega had been protecting the hearts inside those ancient walls every single day. The soul always speaks first. The mind simply takes longer to understand what it has already heard. November arrived wrapped in quiet gray skies, and a gentle mist settled over Blackwood Keep before sunrise each morning. Frost clung to the castle gardens, turning every blade of grass into silver glass beneath the first light of dawn. The mountains looked peaceful from a distance, yet inside the Alpha King another silent winter had begun. Ethan Blackwood no longer needed the palace physicians to tell him something had changed. The restless uneasiness inside his chest had grown stronger with each passing day. It no longer visited only during the night. Now it followed him into council meetings, military inspections, and quiet moments that had once brought him peace. He still carried himself with calm authority, but the effort required to maintain that composure became heavier every sunrise. The ancient wolf beneath his disciplined exterior seemed unwilling to rest. During one lengthy council session discussing winter trade routes, Ethan suddenly lost his concentration halfway through a report. Elder Nathan paused, noticing the king staring silently toward the rain-covered windows rather than the maps spread across the table. "Your Majesty?" the elder asked gently. Ethan blinked as though waking from a distant thought. "Please continue." His voice remained steady, but Captain Mason Brooks exchanged a quiet glance with the elder. Both men recognized the growing exhaustion hidden beneath the king's composed expression. Later that afternoon, Ethan attempted to clear his mind by walking alone through the northern forest trail surrounding the castle. The familiar path had always brought him comfort since childhood. Towering pine trees shielded the winding road from harsh winds, while small streams flowed gently across smooth stones polished by countless seasons. Yet even nature failed to quiet the invisible storm within him. Every sound felt strangely distant. Every breath remained incomplete. Orion followed several yards behind without making a sound. The old silver wolf usually walked beside Ethan with calm confidence, but today he repeatedly stopped, lifted his head toward the castle in the distance, and quietly sniffed the cold air before continuing forward. Ethan noticed the unusual behavior. "What is troubling you, old friend?" Orion simply looked back toward Blackwood Keep once more before lowering his head. The answer remained beyond words. Meanwhile, Evelyn spent the afternoon helping prepare the great hall for the annual winter blessing gathering. Long tables were polished until they reflected the warm glow of hanging lanterns. Fresh, evergreen branches decorated the stone fireplace, while children from the nearby village practiced holiday songs that would be performed for castle guests later that week. Evelyn quietly encouraged every nervous child, adjusting ribbons, tying loose scarves, and reminding them that beautiful songs came from joyful hearts rather than perfect voices. Her gentle laughter drifted through the hall, soft enough to calm anxious little faces before rehearsals began. At nearly the same moment, several miles away, Ethan suddenly stopped walking. Without warning, the constant pressure inside his chest eased for a single peaceful breath. It lasted only seconds before fading again as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan frowned thoughtfully. The timing felt strangely familiar. He could not explain why, yet somewhere deep inside, his wolf had briefly become still. Back inside the castle, the children finished singing, and Evelyn quietly excused herself to return to her ordinary duties. The peaceful feeling vanished just as she stepped outside the hall. By evening, Ethan returned to Blackwood, heap more weary than when he had left. After dinner, he retired early, hoping sleep might finally quiet the growing unrest. Instead, he found himself pacing slowly across his private chamber while moonlight stretched across the wooden floor. Books lay unopened beside the fireplace. Letters remained unanswered upon his desk. Every attempt to settle his thoughts ended the same way. His eyes drifted toward the window, overlooking the eastern gardens where lanterns still glowed softly among the frost-covered paths. Somewhere beyond those quiet lights, Evelyn finished placing warm blankets inside the guest quarters before stopping briefly to help Mrs. Eleanor Hayes carry another basket upstairs. She smiled, wished the older woman a peaceful evening, and disappeared into the servants' wing with the same quiet grace that had marked every ordinary day of her life. She never knew that each step carrying her farther from the Alpha King allowed the invisible restlessness inside him to awaken once more. Standing alone beneath the silent moon, Ethan finally admitted one truth he could no longer dismiss. The peace he had desperately searched for through discipline, ancient rituals, and endless determination seemed to appear only when one gentle Omega happened to be near. Yet instead of drawing closer to the answer, he remained determined to keep walking in the opposite direction, unaware that his own stubborn heart was slowly exhausting the very wolf it had spent years trying so hard to control. The deepest wounds are often left not by cruel words, but by the silence of the people we hoped would speak. The first snow of the season arrived quietly over Blackwood Keep, covering rooftops, pine branches, and stone pathways with a clean blanket of white. The entire castle seemed softer beneath the fresh snowfall. Yet beneath that peaceful landscape, an invisible tension slowly tightened around hearts that had not yet realized how close they stood to losing something precious. Preparations for the winter blessing celebration filled every corner of the estate. Village families arrived carrying homemade pies, knitted blankets, carved wooden ornaments, and baskets of dried herbs to share with neighbors before the harshest weeks of winter settled across the mountains. Children laughed while chasing one another through the courtyard, their footprints creating playful patterns across the untouched snow. Evelyn Carter spent most of the morning helping elderly visitors find warm seats near the great fireplace before quietly carrying trays of hot cider between guests. She greeted everyone with the same gentle warmth she always offered, never expecting anyone to remember how much of the celebration quietly depended upon her thoughtful hands. Orion remained close behind her throughout the day, drawing amused smiles from children who happily scratched behind the old wolf's ears whenever he paused beside them. As afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the great hall, two younger servants stood near the staircase whispering while watching Orion patiently follow Evelyn toward the kitchens. One servant folded her arms with a knowing smile. "Have you noticed how the old guardian never leaves her side anymore?" The other laughed quietly. "Perhaps she has discovered the quickest way to attract attention inside this castle." Their voices remained low, but another maid passing nearby overheard only part of the conversation before carrying the unfinished rumor into the laundry room. By evening, the harmless observation had quietly changed shape. Someone suggested Evelyn enjoyed finding excuses to cross paths with the Alpha King. Another wondered aloud whether the elderly wolf's unusual affection meant she hoped people would notice her. No one intended real cruelty. Most spoke carelessly, treating quiet speculation as harmless entertainment during a long winter gathering. Rumors, however, rarely remain harmless once they begin searching for new ears. Evelyn first heard the whispers while placing fresh blankets inside the guest wing. Two visiting attendants fell silent the moment she entered the hallway. One offered an awkward smile. The other quickly looked away. As Evelyn continued folding linens, she caught only a single unfinished sentence drifting behind the closing door. Everyone says she keeps finding reasons to be near. The rest disappeared into muffled voices, but she understood enough. She lowered her eyes, took one slow breath, and quietly finished arranging the blankets exactly as she always had. Her hands never trembled. She did not defend herself because there was no accusation spoken directly to her. Yet something inside her heart became unexpectedly heavy. That evening, Captain Mason Brooks privately informed Ethan that unnecessary gossip had begun spreading among a few servants. "It will probably disappear within a day or two," Mason said calmly. "Most rumors do." Ethan remained silent while signing another stack of official documents. He understood better than anyone how quickly palace gossip faded once ignored. Responding publicly often gave idle conversations more life than they deserved. "Do not encourage it," Ethan finally replied. "It will pass." Mason nodded respectfully and left the study believing the matter settled. Ethan returned to his paperwork, unaware that his decision, though reasonable from a king's perspective, would soon carry a cost far greater than either man imagined. Late that night, Evelyn walked alone through the snow-covered gardens after finishing her final duties. Orion quietly appeared from beneath the old oak tree and joined her without hesitation. She rested one hand gently against his thick silver fur while looking toward the softly glowing windows of the castle. "I never wanted anyone to misunderstand simple kindness," she whispered with a sad smile. Orion looked up at her with calm amber eyes, remaining silently beside her until she continued walking. From the upper balcony, Ethan happened to notice the lonely figure crossing the moonlit garden below. For a brief moment, he considered calling out to ask whether everything was all right. Instead, he remained still, convincing himself that maintaining distance continued to be the wiser choice. Evelyn never looked toward the balcony. She simply disappeared into the quiet winter night, carrying the same gentle dignity she had always possessed. Neither of them realized that sometimes the loudest answer a wounded heart hears is not a harsh accusation. It is the silence of someone who had every opportunity to stand beside it and chose to remain still. Sometimes the strongest goodbye is the one spoken without anger, without tears, and without anyone realizing it is happening until the silence becomes impossible to ignore. The morning after the winter blessing celebration, Blackwood Keep awakened beneath another blanket of fresh snow. Smoke curled gently from stone chimneys, and the scent of warm cinnamon bread drifted through the castle corridors as servants prepared breakfast for guests who would soon begin their journeys home. Everything appeared peaceful on the surface, yet Evelyn Carter carried an unfamiliar heaviness inside her heart. The whispers she had overheard the previous day had not broken her spirit, but they had quietly changed something deeper. She had always believed that kindness should leave people feeling lighter. Now she feared her presence had begun creating burdens for others instead. After finishing her morning duties, Evelyn visited Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, Mr. Henry Collins, and the children gathered inside the library, saying goodbye with the same warm smile she always wore. She never mentioned leaving. Instead, she thanked each person for every lesson, every conversation, and every ordinary day they had unknowingly made meaningful. The elderly librarian noticed her lingering a little longer beside the bookshelves. "You look as though you are memorizing this room," he said gently. Evelyn smiled softly while running her fingertips across the worn wooden edge of a familiar bookshelf. Some places deserve to be remembered exactly as they are. By late afternoon, she quietly requested a private meeting with steward Margaret Ellis, the woman responsible for managing the household staff. Margaret welcomed her into the office with a kind smile, expecting another routine discussion about winter schedules. Instead, Evelyn carefully placed a neatly folded letter upon the desk. "I would like to resign from my position," she said calmly. Margaret stared at her in complete surprise. "Resign? Have you accepted another opportunity?" Evelyn slowly shook her head. "Not yet. I simply believe the castle will continue doing well without me." The steward looked at the young Omega for several long moments before speaking again. Has someone treated you unfairly? Evelyn hesitated only briefly. No one has been intentionally cruel. Her answer remained truthful, yet incomplete. Margaret understood enough not to press further. She reached across the desk and gently covered Evelyn's hand. You have brought more kindness into these halls than you probably realize. Evelyn smiled with quiet gratitude. Then perhaps it is time for that kindness to follow someone else who needs it. Her resignation was accepted with sincere regret, and arrangements were made for her departure 2 mornings later after the last visiting families returned home. Word spread quietly among the household staff. Many servants expressed genuine sadness, while others seemed surprised that someone as dependable as Evelyn had chosen to leave so suddenly. The rumors that had begun only days earlier disappeared almost immediately, replaced instead by unexpected silence. Even those who had repeated careless gossip found themselves strangely unsettled by the news. That evening, Orion searched every familiar corner of the castle before finally finding Evelyn sitting alone beneath the old oak tree overlooking the snow-covered gardens. The elderly silver wolf approached slowly, resting beside her without making a sound. Evelyn leaned gently against his warm fur while watching delicate snowflakes drift through the evening sky. I am going to miss you, she whispered. Orion lifted his head and released a long, quiet breath before resting one large paw against the edge of her coat. It felt almost like a plea for her to stay. From the council chamber window above, Ethan happened to notice the familiar pair sitting together beneath the falling snow. Something inside his chest tightened with an urgency he had never experienced before. Without understanding why, he immediately left the meeting and walked quickly toward the gardens. Yet by the time he reached the old oak tree, Evelyn had already returned inside the servant's wing. Only Orion remained, staring silently toward the closed doorway she had disappeared behind. The old wolf refused to move when Ethan called his name. Instead, he looked directly into the Alpha King's eyes with a sadness that seemed almost human. That night, Ethan slept less than a single hour. The restless presence beneath his heart refused every attempt at peace, pacing endlessly through the darkness as though searching desperately for something already slipping beyond reach. He still did not know that Evelyn had chosen to leave Blackwood Keep. He only knew that for the first time since inheriting the crown, the silence surrounding him no longer felt like discipline. It felt like the beginning of a loss his heart had been far too slow to recognize. Truth does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it waits quietly inside forgotten pages until the moment every proud heart has run out of answers. Dawn broke beneath a pale winter sky as soft snow continued falling across Blackwood Keep. Before the first bell echoed through the castle, Steward Margaret Ellis stood outside the Alpha King's study, holding a single folded letter in trembling hands. She had delayed delivering the news for only one night, hoping perhaps Evelyn Carter might reconsider her decision before sunrise. When Ethan invited her inside, he immediately noticed the unusual sadness upon her face. Margaret carefully placed the resignation letter on the desk without speaking. Ethan glanced at the familiar handwriting before lifting his eyes in confusion. Whose letter is this? His voice remained calm, but something deep inside him had already begun tightening. It belongs to Miss Carter, Margaret answered softly. She leaves tomorrow morning. The room became completely still. Ethan stared at the paper for several long moments as though the words refused to make sense. Leaving? He finally asked. Why? Margaret lowered her gaze. She only said the castle would continue doing well without her. Ethan slowly unfolded the letter. Every sentence expressed gratitude. Every line thanked the household for their kindness. There was not a single complaint, not one accusation, not one mention of the rumors that had quietly spread through the castle. She wished peace upon everyone she had served and apologized only for any inconvenience her departure might cause. The absence of bitterness unsettled Ethan far more deeply than anger ever could have. After Margaret quietly left, Ethan remained seated with the letter resting motionless between his hands. His wolf stirred restlessly beneath the silence. By mid-morning, Elder Nathan arrived, carrying several ancient volumes from the royal archives. The old pack leader had barely slept. During the previous night, he had searched through records preserved across generations, hoping to understand the impossible pattern that had unfolded before his eyes during recent weeks. Thick leather-bound books covered the council table as loose pages filled with handwritten observations lay scattered beside them. Ethan entered the archive room shortly afterward, still carrying Evelyn's resignation letter folded neatly inside his coat pocket. He had intended only to ask whether the elder knew why an ordinary Omega servant might suddenly choose to leave. Instead, he found Nathan studying faded manuscripts with an intensity he had rarely witnessed before. "I believe I found something," the elder said quietly without looking up. Ethan walked closer. "About the wolf?" Nathan nodded slowly. "About something even older." He carefully opened one fragile journal written nearly 200 years earlier by a respected healer who had served another Alpha King during a long winter of unexplained unrest. The faded pages described an exceptionally rare phenomenon known as soul regulation. Nathan read the passage aloud. "There are times when the spirit of an alpha recognizes profound safety in the presence of another soul. Not through command, not through fear, not through destiny imposed by tradition. The wolf chooses peace freely because it trusts completely." Ethan remained silent. Nathan continued reading. "Such peace cannot be forced. It cannot be summoned through ritual. And if the one carrying this gift walks away willingly, the wolf grieves the absence long before the human heart understands what has been lost." The elder slowly closed the ancient journal. "I searched every record we possess. This condition has appeared only a handful of times across our history." Ethan looked toward the snow-covered windows, his thoughts racing through countless quiet moments he had dismissed as coincidence. The balcony beneath the moon, the village school, the greenhouse, the gardens. Every unexpected breath of peace had arrived only when Evelyn happened to be near. Every restless night had followed his deliberate choice to avoid her. "This is not a mating bond," Nathan said gently, answering the question Ethan had not spoken aloud. "The old records make that very clear. It is trust, deep enough that even the ancient wolf recognizes it before the human mind does." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the folded resignation letter still resting inside his hand. For the first time, he understood that Evelyn had never pursued his attention. She had never sought favor, influence, or recognition. Every step away from him had been her attempt to protect his peace, while every step he had taken away from her had quietly wounded the very part of himself he believed he was defending. Outside the archive windows, Orion stood alone beneath the falling snow, facing the eastern road leading away from Blackwood Keep. The old silver wolf did not move. He simply watched the distant path with patient sadness, as though already knowing that by the following sunrise the one presence capable of calming an ancient soul would no longer be waiting inside the castle walls. The hardest distance between two souls is not measured in miles, but in the moment one of them decides to stop reaching back. Morning arrived over Blackwood Keep with a strange stillness, as though even the wind had chosen to hesitate before carrying the truth forward. Snow lay untouched across the eastern road, soft and pale beneath a sky that offered no warmth. Inside the castle, preparations for the Alpha King's daily council meeting continued as usual, yet nothing about Ethan Blackwood felt usual anymore. He had not slept. Not properly. Every time his eyes closed, his mind returned to the same quiet absence. Evelyn Carter no longer inside the castle walls. The word, "leaves tomorrow," had become a silent echo that followed him through every corridor. He stood alone in the council chamber long before the others arrived, staring at the empty chair usually reserved for Elder Nathan. For the first time in years, discipline failed to anchor him. His thoughts drifted toward places he had once avoided. The greenhouse, the western gardens, the library steps where children often laughed while she patiently helped them find the right books. Every memory now carried a weight he had previously refused to notice. Captain Mason Brooks entered quietly, breaking the silence. "Your Majesty, the final preparations for the winter route inspection are ready." Ethan nodded without turning. "Delay them." Mason paused, uncertain. "Sir." Ethan finally looked at him. His expression remained controlled, but something beneath it had changed. "I need time." It was the first time he had spoken those words in months. Not as a command, not as strategy, but as hesitation. Mason did not question further. He simply bowed and left the room, understanding that something far more personal than politics now occupied the king's attention. When the council hall emptied, Ethan remained standing alone. Slowly, almost unconsciously, his hand moved to the folded resignation letter still inside his coat. He had read it so many times that the words no longer felt like ink on paper. They felt like distance becoming real. Elsewhere in the castle, Evelyn Carter completed her final duties with the same quiet care she had always offered. She returned borrowed linens, washed the last set of breakfast dishes, and gently folded the cleaning cloth she had used for nearly 2 years. Not once did she complain. Not once did she allow her emotions to interrupt the work she had promised to complete. When Mrs. Eleanor Hayes asked whether she would visit the gardens one last time before leaving, Evelyn only smiled. "I think I would rather remember them as they are now," she replied softly. By midday, word of her departure had spread beyond the servant quarters. Some were surprised. Some were saddened. Others remained uncertain why someone so quietly dependable would choose to leave without explanation. Yet no one stopped her. Perhaps they assumed she would change her mind. Perhaps they believed people like her always stayed longer than they planned. By late afternoon, Evelyn stood in the courtyard with a small, simple bag resting at her side. There were no grand farewells. Only a few servants gathered quietly to wish her well. Orion stood near her feet, refusing to leave his place beside her even as the cold wind grew sharper. She knelt briefly, resting her hand against his thick silver fur. "You will be fine without me," she whispered gently. Orion did not move. His gaze remained fixed on the eastern gate. At the same time, high within the castle, Ethan finally made a decision he could no longer avoid. Without summoning guards or informing advisors, he left the council chamber and walked quickly through the halls. Each step felt heavier than the last. The absence he had ignored was no longer something he could explain away with reason. It had become something alive inside him, demanding acknowledgement. As he reached the main entrance, he saw movement beyond the frost-covered gates. A single carriage waited near the road. Evelyn stood beside it, speaking softly with the driver while adjusting her coat against the cold. Ethan stopped at the top of the stone steps. For a brief moment, the world around him seemed to slow. The noise of the castle faded. The wind quieted. Even his thoughts fell into silence. He had spent weeks convincing himself that distance was protection, that absence was wisdom, that control was strength. Yet standing there, watching her prepare to leave without looking back, he understood something he had refused to accept. The peace he had felt in her presence was not a coincidence. It was not imagination. It was not weakness. It was the only stillness his wolf had ever known without resistance. And now it was leaving. Evelyn stepped into the carriage. The door closed gently. The horses shifted forward, their breath visible in the cold air. Only then did she glance toward the castle one final time. Not toward the windows, not toward the gates, just the direction of the place she had once quietly served. Ethan took one step forward, then another, but he did not call out. Not yet. Because for the first time in his life, the Alpha King realized that commanding someone to stay was not the same as earning the right to be followed. The moment between letting go and holding on is often so fragile that even a breath can break it. The carriage wheels turned slowly against the frozen road outside Blackwood Keep, leaving thin lines across the untouched snow as Evelyn Carter sat quietly inside, hands folded over a small cloth bag resting on her lap. She did not look back again, not because she felt nothing, but because she believed that looking back would make leaving harder for everyone involved. Outside the castle gates, Ethan Blackwood remained frozen in place at the top of the stone steps, watching the distance grow between himself and the one presence his soul had only just begun to understand. The cold air pressed against his lungs, but it was not the weather that made breathing difficult. It was the realization that for the first time in his life, authority meant nothing in the face of absence. He had commanded armies. He had negotiated peace between rival packs. He had silenced entire councils with a single word. Yet none of those skills had prepared him for the quiet departure of one Omega who never once asked for his attention. The carriage moved farther down the eastern road, passing beneath rows of bare winter trees. Orion stood beside Ethan, unusually still, his amber eyes fixed on the same direction as if silently refusing to accept what was unfolding. Then, without warning, the old wolf took a step forward. Not toward the castle, toward the road. Ethan finally moved. Not with command, not with authority, but with something far more uncertain. Human urgency. He descended the steps quickly, boots pressing into the snow as he crossed the courtyard without acknowledging the guards who instinctively straightened at his passing. No orders were given. No escorts followed. For the first time, the Alpha King walked alone not because he chose isolation, but because he could not afford anything between himself and the one person disappearing from his reach. The carriage had reached the outer bend of the road when Evelyn finally noticed movement behind it. The driver slowed slightly, sensing someone approaching from the castle gates. Through the thin winter mist, Ethan appeared at the edge of the road, his dark coat catching the pale light of the morning sun. The carriage stopped. The horses exhaled softly, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. For several seconds, no one spoke. The world between them felt suspended, as if even time was waiting to see what would happen next. Evelyn slowly lowered the window curtain. When she saw him standing there, something in her expression shifted, not in surprise, but in quiet resignation. She had not expected pursuit. She had only hoped for peace. Ethan stepped closer, stopping a few feet from the carriage door. For a moment, he seemed to search for the correct command, the correct structure, the correct way to reclaim control of a situation that no longer belonged to him. But none of those words came. Instead, what left his voice was far quieter than anything he had ever spoken as king. "Do not go yet." The words hung in the cold air, not as an order, but as something unfamiliar coming from him. Evelyn did not respond immediately. Her gaze lowered slightly, as though she was weighing not his authority, but the honesty behind it. "My presence causes confusion here," she finally said gently. "That was never my intention." Ethan shook his head once, slowly, as if rejecting an idea he had once believed without question. "The confusion was never you." The silence that followed was heavier than any council chamber argument or battlefield command. Somewhere behind him, Orion stopped at the edge of the courtyard, watching without moving forward. The old wolf remained still, as if understanding that this moment belonged only to the two standing between departure and decision. Ethan took a slow breath, one that did not carry the discipline of an alpha king, but the uncertainty of a man forced to face what he had been avoiding. "I thought distance was protection," he said quietly. "For you, for the kingdom, for everything I could not explain." He paused, his eyes finally meeting hers. "But all it did was make me realize I no longer know how to exist without the peace I only ever felt when you were near." Evelyn remained silent, not because she had no answer, but because she was hearing something she never expected from someone like him. Not power, not command, but admission. Ethan stepped closer to the carriage, stopping just beyond reach. "If you leave now," he said, voice steady but no longer hiding uncertainty, "I will not stop you. But I need you to understand something first." The wind softened around them, as if the world itself had lowered its voice to listen. "I did not realize what you were," he continued. "Not your status, not your role, but what you do to me, to my wolf, to everything I thought I had already mastered." A faint tremor of emotion passed through his controlled expression, though he did not look away. "You were never something I had the right to take for granted." The carriage remained still. The driver waited silently. Orion stood unmoving in the distance. And Evelyn, for the first time since deciding to leave, did not immediately turn away. Because somewhere between silence and truth, something fragile had finally begun to change shape. Not a command, not a bond forced by destiny, but the first moment where an alpha king was no longer asking someone to stay as a ruler, but as someone who had finally understood what it meant to lose. There are moments when silence becomes heavier than words, and in that silence, the truth finally stops hiding. The carriage stood still on the frozen road outside Blackwood Keep, its wheels half sunk into the thin layer of snow that continued to fall in soft, unbroken flakes. Ethan Blackwood remained at the edge of the path, his breath visible in the cold air, his eyes fixed on the closed door that separated him from the one person he had only just begun to understand he could not live without. Inside the carriage, Evelyn Carter sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly over her folded bag. She did not speak immediately, not because she lacked words, but because she had spent so long preparing herself to leave that staying even a few seconds longer felt like stepping into a place she had already said goodbye to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of everything neither of them had said sooner. Ethan finally took a step forward. Then another. His boots pressed into the snow with a slow certainty that had nothing to do with command and everything to do with fear. When he reached the carriage door, he did not knock. He did not demand. He simply stood there, as if waiting for permission to exist in the same space as her decision. The door opened gently from inside. Evelyn stepped down, her cloak brushing lightly against the frozen ground. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world behind them faded into distant wind and soft creaking wood. Ethan looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a servant of his castle, not as an omega among many, but as the single presence that had unknowingly altered the balance of everything inside him. "I cannot pretend this is easy," he said quietly. His voice carried no authority, only honesty. Evelyn nodded faintly, her gaze steady but calm. "Leaving rarely is." Ethan exhaled slowly, as though each breath required effort he had never been taught to manage without control. "When I asked you to stay," he continued, "it was not because I understood what you were to me." He paused, searching for words that did not sound like commands, negotiations, or strategies. Words that simply existed as truth. "I understand now that I was never the only one affected by silence." Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, though she did not interrupt. Ethan lowered his gaze for a brief moment before meeting hers again. "You never asked for anything. You never demanded recognition. And yet every time you were near, something inside me stopped fighting itself." The wind shifted gently between them, carrying the faint sound of distant forest branches moving under snow. Orion remained still behind Ethan, watching without interference, as if even the old wolf understood that this was not a moment that could be guided by instinct alone. Ethan took another step closer, stopping at a distance that was no longer formal, no longer distant, but uncertain. "I spent years believing control was strength," he said quietly. "But control did not stop the restlessness inside me. It only taught me how to ignore it." A brief pause followed, heavier than any council meeting silence he had ever endured. "Until you." Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly, around the strap of her bag, not in fear, but in quiet awareness of what his words were beginning to reveal. Ethan continued, his voice lower now, no longer shaped by the expectation of authority. "I do not know what name to give what I feel when you are near. I only know that when you are gone, I am no longer the same." For the first time, he did not look like a king addressing a decision. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he could not command his way through. Evelyn remained still for a long moment, her expression unreadable, as though she was weighing not his rank, not his position, but the sincerity behind every word he had finally chosen to speak without armor. "I never meant to become something you depended on," she said softly. Ethan shook his head once. "You did not become something I depended on." His voice steadied, though quieter than before. "You became the only place where I did not feel like I had to fight to exist." The words lingered between them, dissolving slowly into the cold air. Behind them, the carriage driver waited in silence, uncertain whether to move or remain still. Orion lowered his head slightly, exhaling a slow breath that seemed almost like understanding. Evelyn looked toward the distant road for a brief moment, where her journey had once been clear and final. Then she looked back at Ethan, not with decision, not with refusal, but with the first sign of hesitation she had allowed herself since choosing to leave. And in that hesitation, something neither of them had planned, commanded, or controlled began to quietly shift the direction of everything that was about to come next. The world did not change because someone demanded it to. It changed because, at last, someone chose to listen. The snow along the eastern road of Blackwood Keep had begun to settle into stillness, as though even the storm above had paused to witness what the hearts below could not yet decide. The carriage remained unmoving, its horses breathing softly into the cold air, their patience mirroring the silence between two souls standing only a few steps apart. Ethan Blackwood did not move closer, not because he lacked courage, but because, for the first time in his life, he understood that approaching someone was no longer about command or authority. It was about permission. Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of the frozen path, her hand still resting lightly on the strap of her small bag. The wind touched her hair, carrying with it the distant sound of the forest, the same forest that had once felt like escape and now felt like uncertainty. She looked at Ethan, not as a king, not as a figure of power, but as a man stripped of everything except truth. And in that truth, she saw something she had never expected to see so clearly. Not possession, not expectation, but quiet recognition. Orion slowly stepped forward from behind Ethan, stopping a few feet away from Evelyn. The old silver wolf lowered his head, not in submission, but in calm understanding. For the first time in days, his breathing was steady, as though the tension that had haunted him had finally softened into something gentle and familiar. Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice no longer shaped by strategy or fear of loss. "I will not ask you to stay," he said quietly. The words felt heavier than any command he had ever given. They were not an attempt to hold her. They were an admission that holding her had never been his right. Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, as if something inside her had quietly loosened. Ethan continued, his gaze steady despite the weight of everything he was finally allowing himself to feel. "For too long, I believed that strength meant control, that leadership meant deciding what should remain close and what should be kept at a distance." A faint pause followed, filled only by the sound of snow shifting under the wind. "But I understand now that I never truly understood what was calming me. I only knew that when you were near, I was no longer fighting myself." Evelyn looked away briefly, toward the quiet road that had once represented her only certainty. The carriage remained behind her, waiting without urgency. Even the driver seemed to sense that time had become something softer here, something no longer measured in departure or arrival. Ethan took one slow step forward, then stopped again, respecting the invisible boundary that neither of them had yet named. "If you choose to leave," he said gently, "I will respect that choice. But I needed you to know that what I felt was never ownership. It was recognition." The word hung in the cold air between them, simple and unforced. Evelyn finally lowered her hand from the bag. Her breath trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the strange weight of being seen without being claimed. "I did not leave because I stopped caring," she said softly. "I left because I thought my presence was causing confusion where there should have been peace." Ethan shook his head slowly. "The confusion was never you." A quiet stillness followed, deeper than anything the castle had known in years. Orion sat down slowly beside the path, his gaze moving between them with calm certainty, as though he already understood what was forming in the space between silence and understanding. Evelyn took one small step forward, then another, not toward the carriage, not toward the castle, but toward the moment itself. "If I stay," she said gently, "it will not be because I am needed." Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "Then let it be because you choose to." The wind softened again, as though the mountain itself was exhaling after a long-held breath. Slowly, Evelyn turned away from the carriage. Not in surrender, not in return, but in decision. She walked a few steps toward Ethan, stopping at a distance that no longer felt like separation, only space for understanding to exist without pressure. The carriage behind her remained where it was, no longer waiting for departure. Orion stood once more, this time moving forward to rest beside her again, as if confirming what words no longer needed to explain. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. For the first time since inheriting the crown, there was no struggle beneath his chest, no restless pacing of the wolf within, only stillness. When he opened his eyes again, he spoke one final truth, not as an alpha king, but as someone who had finally learned the difference between power and presence. "I do not know what comes next," he said quietly, "but I know I do not want to walk it without understanding what I nearly lost." Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the castle behind him, then toward the road behind her, and finally back at the space between them. And in that space, she made her choice without urgency, without fear, and without apology. She stepped forward once more, not into possession, not into escape, but into something neither of them yet had a name for. Behind them, the carriage remained still, no longer a symbol of leaving, but of a path no longer needed. And within Blackwood Keep, for the first time in a long time, the ancient wolf beneath the Alpha King did not pace, did not ache, and did not search. It simply rested, as if it had finally found the only silence it ever truly understood.